Well, and controls. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Just a reminder that today I do have to run over pretty much directly after class to get set up for my next thing. The thing that I have that goes after class is actually our departmental seminar. And the one today, I meant to post it on our website. It's actually pretty interesting. He's a guy that uses drones to study volcanoes. So if you're interested, we're going to be having his webinar shown in PISB 104. That's the building where you have lab. If you're interested, I also can give you the Zoom webinar code after class real fast before I run over there to set it up. But this particular one seems cool. It's drones studying volcanoes. How cool is that, right? Couple reminders, quiz 3, make sure you do it today. So that's the one from last week. This week's quiz 4, is open now. This week, there are 2 participation discussion boards. I haven't started grading those yet, and I'm not sure if I'm going to write comments for everybody. Week 5, next week, we have our first midterm, and that's going to be opening on Thursday. So there's not class next Thursday. You can take the exam during that time if you want to. If you want to take it at a different time, you can. I'm just giving you that time to take it. Next week, we will have 2 different participations. One is a survey, in quotation marks, because it's actually set up as a quiz so that I get the automatic grading on it. It's again it's participation, so it's a completion credit. It's basically, did you take the exam during class some other time, or you forgot to take it? I'm just trying to get a feel of how many people are actually using that Thursday class period to take the exam. And the other thing is a wiki that is another mnemonic, this time on the geologic timescale. So those aren't available yet. They will become available next week. Oh, come on. All right, so we have one more little thing to do in sedimentary geology, and then we're going to move on to Earth history. So the last bit is precipitation rocks. So these are things that are happening in caves, hot springs. It's some place where we have rock material being precipitated out of water. So these are chemical sedimentary rocks. You had some sort of a water solution that had ions in it that then precipitate out into rock form. These actually are crystalline. They have that interlocking texture, but they're sedimentary rock. So you can either have the initial crystal growth that's happening in the solution or as the water leaves, or you can have recrystallization as water moves through buried material. So there are several classes. Evaporates is where you have large bodies of water that evaporate and leave behind material, hence the name. We have travertine and geyserite. These are 2 different types of rock, but both formed through hydrothermal, or not always hydrothermal. Geyserite is hydrothermal, travertine is not necessarily hydrothermal, but this is groundwater that's moving around and leaving small deposits behind. And the final one is replacement chert. So this is chert, which is SiO2, silica, that is being left behind in another form. So evaporates are, you have bodies of water that evaporate and leave behind material. So when the water leaves, the suspended material gets deposited. If you have a thick deposit of evaporates, that means you had to have a lot of water. So this is similar idea to when you melt snow. You have a lot of snow and you end up getting a little bit of water out of it. If you have a lot of water, you get very small deposits of evaporates. So when we have these massive evaporate deposits, that means we had massive quantities of water there at some point. The common ones are halite, rock salt, and gypsum. So salt flats, the salt deserts where they do racing of motor vehicles, there was once large bodies of water there, and that evaporated away, leaving behind the salt. So, Death Valley, we have these massive deposits of salt beds because there used to be a massive body of water there. You can get this on a small scale. You can have small lakes. They get small amounts of salt that come into the water. So it's being brought in by, even just streams. And as that water evaporates, it's going to leave a ring of salt. So I don't have a picture of that. So another salt is interesting. There can be some really interesting salt formations. So these are some domes that are formed out of salt. You can get salt domes. They're massive deposits of salt that we mine for economic reasons. And then the mined areas can be used for storage. This is in Sicily. So these are rings of salt. This is a person standing in a salt mine. So all the other salt that was in this area has been excavated out. Massive amounts of water would have been necessary to form these formations. Travertine is cave deposits. So if you've ever heard the term travertine tile in building, most of that is not actually travertine, because travertine is very specifically from either caves or thermal hot springs. So this is where you have calcium carbonate being precipitated from groundwater. And this is happening at slow, very slow. In a cave, it's happening one little drip at a time. At hot springs, it's happening a little bit faster. This is an example of one of those hot springs. I've actually been to this hot spring. I looked it up to make sure that this was the one I remember going to in Turkey. I was horrified when I went to this hot spring because it is a tourist destination and people do walk across the formations and through the water, which makes the formations no longer grow because the oil from your hands will actually prevent future growth of these formations. It's beautiful, but it's not going to get any bigger. So this is a chemical reaction. So you have calcium, you have calcium in the water. When it hits the open air, it degasses, and that leaves behind a small precipitate of calcium carbonate and a little bit of water. And so we have different forms. This is an example of a cave in Kutztown. So, you have different names for these different formations. You have stalactites, stalagmites. You can also have columns where the two connect each other. The general name for any sort of cave formation is speleothem. So we will talk about this a little bit more when we talk about groundwater and sinkholes. We can also have geyserite, which this is material that's deposited at a geyser. So this is silica now, so SiO2, and it's coming from hot water as it reaches the surface in a geyser. And so if you go to see a geyser, you often see very pretty prismatic colors. That's due to this material. And the final one is replacement chert. Replacement chert is where you have SiO2 chert going into take the place of something else. So we have different names for it depending on the color and where it happens. So we have flint, which tends to be either black or gray, and that's because it has organic matter in it. We have jasper, which is red and yellow from iron oxides. If we are having chert replacing wood that preserves the wood grain, we call it petrified wood. So petrified wood is no longer wood. It is actually rock that has replaced that wood. And then agate is where we have, it's a general term for silica, and it tends to have these rings to it. So these are all the same chemical composition. They just have different names based on where they're found. And flint is the material that's often used, or is one of the materials often used to make arrowheads. And it used to be made into the strikers in old-fashioned firearms. And they called it flint knapping because they would cut the or shape the flint into a small bit to strike to make a spark that would then shoot the gun. So flint knapping is the name for shaping of this type of material. Obsidian, again, the same chemical composition, is also used a lot. And just general chert is used. So it's all the same chemical composition. It's just found in different places, different colors, different looks to it. So which of these is not a type of sedimentary rock? Biochemical, chemical, clastic, or igneous? Okay, good. So the only hands I saw went up for igneous. So I could have been really mean and put crystalline in there because there are some material rocks that have a crystalline texture, but I decided not to be mean. So we talked about rivers on Tuesday. They tend to have these lens-shaped sand and gravel channels, and then they will have the mudstones and the floodplains. We talked about marine environments, which tend to have organisms building reefs, and those then become the base material to form biochemical sedimentary rocks. And then we have the chemical sedimentary rocks, are those that come through evaporation or precipitation. So evaporites are the ones where the water has left in mass, leaving behind sheets of material. Precipitation is where you have drips of water that leave behind a small deposit of material. So it says week 5. I realized on the schedule that I didn't have the timing quite right. So we're going to go into looking at Earth history now, and we'll finish this up on Tuesday. So there are many ways to show Earth's history. This is a common one with the spiral, where all the interesting stuff happens really high up on the spiral, which is a very small part of the Earth's history if you look at the actual timeline. We'll see this in a couple different ways. So why am I doing it here? I'm going to let this, I put it here so that lab can get caught up. So this week you are doing igneous rocks. Next week you'll be doing sedimentary rocks. The week after that, you'll be doing metamorphic rocks. And in week 6, we'll also be doing metamorphic rocks in lecture. So it gets it back a little bit in sequence. We'd be even further apart if I jumped right into metamorphic rocks now. We will be talking about dating, geologic dating, probably Tuesday. There's a lab on that. That's week 7. So that's a little bit off, but you'll have at least had experienced it in class. And then also, the history of life, what we're going to be talking about, it's found in the sedimentary rocks that we just went over. So it does make sense. So what's a fossil and how do we get fossilization? So true or false, a fossil is evidence of past life that has been preserved. So true? Okay. Does anyone think it's false? Okay, good. Yeah. A fossil is just some sort of evidence that there was past life and it's been preserved in some way. So there are different ways we can think of these. We can think of body fossils, which are actually parts of the organism that have been preserved. Or we can think about trace fossils. So this is some sort of impact of the organism that's been preserved. So how do we get fossilization? There are different types of fossilization. We can have, and we're going to go through each of these. Impression fossils, mineralized fossils, casts and molds, and then unaltered remains. So Impression fossils are when you have organic matter that gets buried, and then the weight of the sediment that's burying it causes the organic matter to impress into the underlying and overlying sediment. And then that organic matter will decay away, leaving behind that impression. So this is, you took some mud, you pressed a leaf into it, let the mud dry out, it became rock, and that leaf would decay away, leaving behind the impression of the leaf. That is extremely dark. This is a fish. So this is a fish type shape. When we have the hard parts of the organism are buried, and then we have dissolved minerals will precipitate out into the pore spaces and the cell structures and preserve the shape of that material. That's what we call these mineralized fossils. So the important thing here is that we are preserving the details of the internal structure of the organism. This is the same thing that petrified wood is that we just talked about, where we replace the wood with chert. We can do this with other organisms. So bone in the fossil record is very rarely still bone. It's become some other mineral. The bone has been replaced by something else in most cases, because the bone itself wouldn't survive millions of years. We can do this with other things too, the shells. So this is the idea that some sort of mineralization has replaced the organic matter. And again, here we're preserving the detail inside. So we're not only preserving the shape of the outside, now we can actually get the detail of the inside. There are actually examples of skulls where you can see imprints from the brain, that you can actually get some of the cranial shape. So they can figure out like the brain size of some of these ancient creatures. So there are some very nice examples. You have to get lucky to get them though. Let me say, I am not a paleontologist, so I may mispronounce some of these names, and that's why I'm going to skip some of the names. Casts and molds. So a mold is where you have unfilled spaces that was from where material decayed away. So you had an organism that was buried, the organism decayed away, and it left that opening. That's called a mold. A cast is if something else then goes in and fills in that empty space. So this is the same idea as casts and molds that are used in arts. It's very close to, it's a mold and an impression fossil are pretty similar. It's a very similar idea. Impression fossils tend to be more flat. The molds tend to be more 3D. So these are going to give us information about the external and internal surfaces. So this is where we're actually getting, this one would be a cast. So this organism would have left a empty space that minerals then came in and precipitated out. And so now we basically have a replica of the organism. We can make the replica ourselves. So when we find molds, we can fill them with plaster and make our own cast. A cast fossil, though, is where it's been done in nature. And then we can have unaltered remains. So this is where you had material that was protected from weathering or from scavenging animals and decomposition. So this can happen in certain specific cases. So peat bogs, you hear about the peat mummies. Permafrost, we have found samples of woolly mammoths. Very dry environments, so like deserts or caves can do this. So we have natural mummification. We can also have preservation in amber. So this is where you have plant sap that surrounds some sort of, normally like a bug, and then hardens, and then the bug remains. And tar sands can actually lead to this prevention of decomposition. So if you get creeped out by mummies, please look away, because I'm about to show you a picture of a preserved body that's basically a mummy. So if you don't want to see this, close your eyes or look away. I will tell you when it's okay. So here's an example of a preserved, we still have skin, a little bit of muscle tissue, you can see the bone. So this would be unaltered remains. All right, if you looked away, it's okay to look back. This is an example of an entire insect that has been preserved in amber. You hadn't noticed, I like Jurassic Park. This is what they're talking about in Jurassic Park, where they're in particularly looking for amber that has insects, how they know that those insects actually fed on dinosaurs is another question. But you do have the entire insect preserved in this manner. And then trace fossils. So this is where we are basically just recording signs left behind. So this isn't the organism itself or parts of the organism, it's just a sign the organism was there. So these are things like tracks, burrows, fecal material. So these can actually tell us about the type of life that was being experienced and the type of life in a region. So here is an example of some footprints from tracks. And this is a coprolite, which is fossilized dung. Gastroliths are another example of these. Gastroliths are the stones that were used to aid in digestion. So these are things that aren't direct parts of an organism, but they still tell us about an organism. So which of these is not a fossil? So a leaf impression in shale, a coprolite, the jawbone my dog found in the field next door, which has happened, worm burrows in sandstone, insect in amber, or dinosaur tracks. Okay, I did see a couple people. So a jawbone that's being found in the field next door most likely is too new to be a fossil. It is still bone. Hopefully it's only bone. They haven't actually gone through the process. Will that eventually be a fossil? Maybe, maybe not. But all these other ones have gone through the process that they are preserved. So not all life is actually going to become a fossil. So there are parts of the body that are just more durable than others. The soft, fleshy stuff is the first stuff to go away. So, paleontologists are the forensics of the geology world. Eyeballs, they go quickly. The organic or the organs, those aren't going to preserve. So the hard parts are more likely to be preserved than the soft parts. There's also what happened to the material after death, I guess, after settling. So if material is buried very quickly after death, especially if it's in water saturated sediments to prevent decay, that has a higher chance of being preserved. If it's in an area that's devoid of oxygen, that has a higher chance of being preserved because you're going to slow down the decaying process, the decomposition process. Material that's exposed, it's going to get broken up, worn away, spread out. It's not going to be preserved. So this ultimately means that mostly we are seeing the hard parts, and these tend to be deposited in certain areas. So they're going to be in things like river deltas, floodplains, marshes, ocean bottoms, all these areas that have a lot of water and not a lot of oxygen. And again, we're only going to preserve certain parts of the organisms. So that means that we only have a tiny percentage of the life on this planet recorded in our fossil record. So, and most of our fossils are actually, we don't get the entire skeleton, even though the skeleton's all hard parts. We tend to only get a small portion of it. So this means the fossil record is very biased. So we have to be aware that there are limitations. So we have to think about what's our resolution in time and space. What are we missing? Are we missing periods of, are we missing hundreds of years, thousands of years, millions of years? Are we only getting certain geographic areas? And then we need to think about what is the fossil record telling us about these past organisms and ecosystems. So what can the fossil record actually explain to us? We also have to think about the nature of fossils themselves. So when we find mass fossil sites, that means that we had one of two things. We either had a mass death event where many organisms went there to die. So an example of that would be like the tar pits, where you had an area where you had large numbers of organisms dying in the same region. Or they can be mass collection sites. So a mass collection site is where material from many organisms in many regions has come together, and then we have basically a pile of fossils. So that happens in flood deposits or river deltas. The way you can tell those apart is that in the case of a mass collection site, all of your fossils tend to be jumbled up. You're not going to find what's known as articulated skeletons. You're going to have a little bit of organism A, a little bit of organism B, then maybe some like K, and it's all mixed up. Whereas a mass death site, you tend to have more complete individuals that you can tell that you had this group of individuals that all came there together. But it also depends on time. The further you are from the creation of that fossil, the less of that fossil is going to remain and the more it's gone through, so the more mixed up it's going to be. So fossils are good for quite a few things. One of the things they're good for is biostratigraphy. So biostratigraphy is looking at rock units using fossil content. So that's looking at what rocks have the same fossils in them and using that to correlate the ages of rocks. We can also use this to look at how organisms have evolved and then figure out relative ages of rocks based on that. So this is what it looks like, that you have the oldest, this is the oldest of these ages, and these are old terms because we have tertiary and quaternary on here. So this is Cambrian, which is the farthest back in time. This is recent time. And we can see these various fossils, and this is how long each of these organisms lived. And we have overlap in times between multiple fossils. So when we have that overlap, we can then determine an age group. So if we see the second fossil and this third fossil, we know that there's only a limited amount of time those two crossed paths. And if we see, one of these other fossils in there too, that can limit our time even more. Some of these have very wide age brackets. This last one has this entire, age bracket. So the white on this graphic is showing the entire range that the fossil was, or that the organism was alive for, and the black is where it can be used to identify time periods. So we call these things index fossils. An index fossil will tell us the time frame of what, when we find these fossils, it can give us an age range for the rock it occurs in. So they are best if it doesn't matter what environment. That means that they're widespread. They're found in many regions, more than just like one region. So a fossil that's only found at very high elevations in the mountains isn't going to be a good index fossil because there are a few places where it's going to be found anyway. That they are widespread. They're found everywhere. Short range refers to the time period. So we want these index fossils to only have a certain geologic time period, that they only have a certain age range. Because if they last from the Cambrian to the Quaternary, they're not going to tell us what time frame. But if they're only existing in the Cambrian and the Ordovician, well, that tells us something. If we find it, then we know that we're in that time period. So this is how it actually works. So, for example, Y is only existing in this short time period. So when we see Y in southern England, and then we also see it in northern France, well, we know these two rock units are the same age, and they may actually be the same rock unit. So, you know, we see Z is only in the early bits, and then X is in the later bits. Now, throughout both these columns, there's another fossil, fossil C, and it's throughout the entire column. So the fossil C would be a bad index fossil because we see it throughout this entire time period. So it's not going to help us. It's not going to help us narrow down the ages of these rocks. So this is the concept of the biozone. So working in Jurassic rocks in Europe, Opel developed this idea that you had overlapping zones in the biostratigraphy. So this is where you have this a certain group of fossils all occurring at the same time, and so that time frame would be the zone. And each of these would be named after a key species, and that's where we get our index fossils. So this zone would be named after one of these key species, probably one of the ones that is appearing at the beginning of the zone. And then eventually these, so, you know, this, we have our zone where we have certain species are first appearing at the beginning of the zone, and then the zone ends with certain species that no longer appear. So again, we're just looking for this assemblage of fossils that will help us age our rocks. Fossils are good for environmental interpretation. They're going to tell us about the environment at the time of deposition. So they're going to tell us, for example, if you have a marine shell in a rock, assuming that rock hasn't moved, that means at one point that area was a marine environment. So the organisms are only going to live in certain environments, right? So we have continental organisms. They're going to, if they're being preserved, that means at the time of preservation, that was a continental area. Transitional environments. So if we have marsh species, then that's going to tell us that at the time of that preservation, that was a marsh. And the same thing for marine environments. Marine fossils are a large portion of the fossil record. And then understanding evolution. So life changes, life adapts. This is another way of looking at time. So the first life actually occurred about 4 billion years ago. It was bacteria. So this is looking at time. So these colored segments are various time periods. These colored rings on the outside are different types of life. So the first life is this purple, 4 billion years ago is when the first life came about. It was bacteria. We started getting more complex life about 2.25 billion years ago. These were the single-celled non-bacteria. So that is here, this blue. So we go from very simple bacteria is life for more than 1 billion years. And then we start getting slightly more complicated life. The first multicellular life was about 1.5 billion years ago. So that's the light blue here. So again, for the first 3 billion years of life, or 2.5 billion years of life, it was bacteria and then single cells. So we didn't start getting multicellular until about 1.5 billion years ago. And let's see, what other notes do I want to say? Okay, throughout here, when we're looking at the geologic timescale, we'll see this suffix, zoic, quite often. Zoic refers to life. So we have Proterozoic, which is before or early life, is what this translates to. Paleozoic would be old life. Mesozoic would be middle life, and then Cenozoic is recent life. So we go Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. These terms aren't fully true because, as we can see, Proterozoic refers to early life. Well, we had life way back here. So those are kind of old terms, but you will see that a lot. You will also see Phanerozoic. So Phanerozoic refers to these Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. That is visible life. So it's when life starts getting more complicated, and you can see that we're getting more types of life. So we're starting to get, the animals actually come in a little bit before then, but we're starting to get much more complicated life in this Phanerozoic. So how closely did you look at that? Life began in which eon or era? So the Hadean, okay, the Archean, the Proterozoic, the Phanerozoic, the Paleozoic, which is part of the Phanerozoic, the Mesozoic, or the Cenozoic. All right, I did see at least one person raise their hand. So the Hadean, which is the earliest eon that we have, is actually when life first began. So evolution, we see this in the fossil record, is where we see characteristics change over successive generations. So an example in humans is that not everyone has wisdom teeth anymore because they're not necessary. Some people, are just missing them totally. We see evolution in humans that, humans' body shapes have changed over fairly short periods of time. We have seen examples of evolution on very short scales. On the long scale, we actually see it very nicely recorded in the geologic record. So genetic traits are inherited from parents, and they're going to be passed on to their offspring. And traits that are favorable to survival, those are more likely to be passed on because those are the individuals that are most likely to survive to reproduce. And so we get selection of those traits over the generations. The geologic record shows evidence of this. We have traits that appear in certain families of organisms, and we see them being passed on to different families. So this is a and so we have that, for example, 4 limbs is one of the earlier traits, and then hair comes in as a later trait. So when amphibians branched off before hair started coming in, specialized shearing teeth came in. It was a specialized trait that marsupials had already branched off before they had. Retractable claws, canines had branched off before they had them. So we can see this through the geologic record through fossils, but we can also look at genetic sequencing to see how different families are related. So we see this with vertebrates, invertebrates, and plants as well. We have had these times of what are known as mass extinctions. So this is when a loss of species greatly outpaces the gain of new species. So this is a chart showing millions of years before present. The line on here is percent extinction, and then the colors, which are very washed out, are the different eras. Do you notice anything? Does anybody notice anything about this slide? No brave souls. Okay. So if we look at where we see these spikes, which are the mass extinctions, we have a large percentage of extinction. They tend to occur. We have one here in the late Ordovician. This one's at the late Devonian. There's a tiny little one at the late Carboniferous. There's a big one at the end of the Permian. There's one at the end of the Triassic. The Jurassic doesn't really have one. And then there's another big one at the end of the Cretaceous. These extinctions tend to happen at the end of these time periods. The reason they happen at the end of the time periods is the geologic time scale is based on the fossil record. So when you have a mass change in your fossils, that was a convenient place to stick an end on a time period. So there is a coincidence. It's not actually a coincidence that where you have these mass extinctions, they tend to be where you flip into a new time period. So, and that's because these time periods are based off of the fossil record. All right, so let's start going into these time periods. And the age of the Earth, the history of the Earth is really fascinating because you have on here the entire history of the Earth, but the majority of the actual time is in this top little bit, but that's not where we're going to spend the most time talking about. So it's rather interesting. So the quote, Precambrian time, this is an old term. It no longer really makes sense. This is where we're looking at the Hadean, the Archean, and the Proterozoic. So these are the ones coming before Cambrian. It's been used since the 19th century, and this is about 88% of the Earth's history. So this column is going up through all of the Earth's history. So 88% of the actual Earth's history is about maybe 1/8 of this column. So only about 20% of our rocks are Precambrian rocks. And those are probably mostly Proterozoic rocks. So there's not a lot of preservation of this time. It is recognized into the Hadean, which is the oldest, 4.6 to 3.8. GA, the A stands for annum, which is year before present. So G is for giga or billion. So GA is billion years before present. This comes from Hades, the Greek god of the underworld. The next one is the Archean, which is 3.8 to 2.5 billion years ago. This is from Greek. I'm not going to try to pronounce it, for origin. And then Proterozoic is about 2.5 to 545 million, 2.5 billion to 545 million years before present. This is for early Proteros. Zoic means living organism. The numbers these numbers they change. They vary slightly between different sources. And really, when you're talking about something that's 3.8 billion years ago, there's going to be a pretty big error on the margin, the error bar there. So you will see a little bit of variation in these numbers from different sources. Here's another way of looking at this. This is a ribbon of time. So the Phanerozoic is everything that's not in Precambrian. So this green bit is 12% of Earth's history. This is everything that's happening after the Cambrian. The Precambrian is the rest of this. So we have the Hadean, the Archean is in the orange, and the blue is the Proterozoic. So again, most of the stuff we focus on our planet is happening very recently. So the Hadean, this is between, again, 4.6 and 4 billion years ago. This was began with the formation of Earth. So this is where we had planetesimals that were accreting together. So they were merging with each other. And we had a lot of impacts occurring. So that's what we're seeing in our rendition of an impact here. So this heated the Earth. We also had radioactive decay occurring, so we were heating internally. So this meant that the Earth was hot enough to partially melt by about that 4.5 billion years ago. The molten Earth then would have undergone chemical differentiation. So we talked about that during igneous rocks. So this is what allowed the molten core material to move towards the interior, and eventually we had that solidified inner iron and nickel core, and then we have the molten outer core. At this time, the ultramafic mantle was still the outermost shell. So we basically had core and mantle. So the moon was happening during this time too. So we had the moon forming. There's a massive impact which broke off part of the proto-Earth, which then coalesced into the moon. So that happened during this time period. Our first liquid ocean and continents were occurring during this as well. So very early, 4.4 billion years ago was when we first started having differentiation between ocean and continent. Possibly plate tectonics started about 4 billion years ago. So our planet has been dynamic from the beginning. So if we had plate tectonics starting, what are we expecting to see? So are we expecting to see different types of crust, rifting, beginning of trenches, or all of the above? Good. We are expecting to see all of the above. So this means we're starting to see all of this beginning at the end of the Hadean. So when we get into the Archean, now we're actually having plate tectonics. So in the Archean, we're going to start forming the continental crust. So that means that we're going to have island arcs forming. We'll also have some hotspot volcanoes. And these are going to start forming small areas of buoyant crust. So we're seeing those here. We've started plate tectonics. So these buoyant blobs of crustal material are now going to collide with each other, because remember that Wilson cycle we talked about? This is what happens. They're going to collide with each other. Those are going to form our proto-continents. And so those continents are going to start getting bigger and bigger, and they're going to break apart and collide together, break apart, collide together. So we can actually see with this graph that we're looking, again, from geologic time, and the percentage of continental area that we currently have is 100%. And we can see that throughout the Archean, we're getting up to 75% of the present continental area. So the Archean was about building the continents. We also start getting traces of fossil life. So the fossil life is beginning as old as the 4 billion mark. We see photosynthesis happening about 3.5 billion years ago. And then about 3.45 billion years ago, we see stromatolites. So this is a type of bacteria. We can see other bacterial colonies as well. So this image is a preserved stromatolite. So I will show you what this looks like actively in a second, but these wavy bits here are the stromatolite. This is an image of bacteria preserved in chert that doesn't give the age, but this is fossilized bacteria that we can see preserved in chert. So this is what a stromatolite looks like in the present. There are these mounds of bacteria, mats of bacteria. And so we can see this preserved in the rock record as far back as almost 3.5 billion years. So these are single-celled, they don't have a nucleus or a mitochondria, but they can perform photosynthesis. So single-celled, but still more complex than just the first life that we had because it can perform photosynthesis. So the Proterozoic, this is a big chunk of early history of the planet, and a lot happens during it. So proto, first zoic life. This was named before we knew that there was life in the Archean and in the Hadean. So this is between about 2.5 billion years ago to about 545 million years ago. So we're starting to see the very alien-looking Archean world form into a more familiar-looking Earth. During the Proterozoic, the planet started looking more like the Earth of today. So this is almost 2 billion years of the planet's history. This is almost half of the planet's history. So the planet's about 4.6 billion years old, and this is 2 billion years of that. There were fewer plates, but they were much bigger. So we did have plate tectonics going on. There were larger and fewer continental land masses. And one of the big things during this time period, we started seeing an oxygenated atmosphere. So we had oxygen. We know that because we see oxygen being preserved in the rock record. This is an example of a banded iron formation. So we see these red iron deposits, and they tend to be in these sheets that often are very wavy because they've undergone metamorphism. And so this tells us that oxygen had to be present because this is oxidized iron. So it had to interact with oxygen. So this is evidence of a buildup of oxygen. And this is occurring worldwide during this time period. So these are actually a major source of iron for our, today. This is, people mine these for iron. So here's another example of a banded iron formation. So these were very abundant from 2.2 to 2.4 billion years ago. We do have continental iron formation. They're called red beds. So these are where it's more red throughout. These are a depositional environment. They only go about, they only started appearing about 2 billion years ago. So they're appearing after these banded iron formation. And this is because these red beds are depositional. So they're either from oxidized material that was deposited, or it's material that was deposited and later oxidized. So both of those sequences take time. So we see a lag in the great oxidation event between these BIFs, banded iron formation, and the continental red beds. So we call this the great oxidation event between 2.45 and 2.2 billion years ago. So we see oxygen increasing from photosynthesis of those bacteria, and we're seeing that photosynthesis is saturating chemical sinks. That's going to allow oxygen to be in the atmosphere. If all of the places that can absorb oxygen are full, that means the oxygen has to go somewhere. It's going to go into the atmosphere. So that means we now have oxygen in our atmosphere. Because we have oxygen in our atmosphere, that means other things are going to happen. So we're going to have marine nitrates forming. These are going to nourish algae, which is then going to give them an edge over other bacteria. So the life that requires oxygen, because there's so much oxygen available, is going to be able to survive better than life that doesn't require it. So this is going to favor the evolution and expansion of multicellular animals, and this is why our world looks the way it does today. There were a few things that were a little bit odd during this time period. we had what are known as snowball Earths at 2.4 and 650 billion years ago, or I'm sorry, million years ago. So 2.4 billion, 650 million. There are two different times of this. And this is basically where most of the planet was covered in ice. And so we had this ice, which has light color, which means it has what's known as a high albedo. So it reflects a lot of light, which then drops the temperature. And it's a positive feedback loop because when you drop the temperature because you have this light material, that means you can produce more ice, which is this light material, because you have lower temperatures, which then is going to spread, which is going to drop the temperature more, and it keeps going. So this has happened two different times. We see evidence of this in the rock record. So we mentioned last week, or no, Tuesday. We mentioned Tuesday. Glacial deposits can have these things called glacial erratics, where we just have a big rock that doesn't make sense. This is an example of one of those in the rock record. So we have boulders that were moved by glaciers. And so we can see this throughout the entire rock record for these time periods. So these time periods where we have these extreme cooling events, we actually saw a rise in certain types of fauna during this time period. So life is diversifying after this snowball condition waned. So we see life diversifying afterwards. The first animals are coming about after this. So here are microscopic images of some of these first animal-like organisms. So we're seeing these things 750 million years ago, 580 million years ago. These things are now multicellular. So they're basically amoebas, but they're multicellular. So life starts out very simple and starts to get more complex. So we have amoeba going into multicellular, going into bilaterally symmetric multicellular. So things get more and more complex as we go. So during the late Proterozoic, life keeps getting more and more complicated. So we're getting this massive leap in complexity. So we go from simple organisms to more complex ones. And then we start getting a lot of soft-bodied multicellular invertebrates. So these are things that look like worms, jellyfish. And we're seeing these in the fossil record. Again, remember, this is not a full record because this stuff is not going to be preserved easily. But we do see these. So here are examples of various fauna. Many of these are impression fossils. Actually, I think all these are impression fossils of different types of species. So these were all found in Australia, but they are occurring globally as well. Again, I am not a paleontologist. I'm not going to try to pronounce any of these. So we had a lot of life in the Proterozoic, but it was very simple life. Now let's talk about what's known as the Cambrian explosion. So this is why we talk about, or we used to use the term Precambrian and then Cambrian. It's because during the Cambrian, life got interesting. So overall, everything after the Proterozoic ends is called the Phanerozoic. Phanerozoic means visible life. We break this into old or ancient life, middle life, and recent life. So the important thing here is that we're now going to have hard-shelled organisms. So we're going to have things like corals, trilobites. These are things that are going to be easier to preserve. So suddenly our fossil record is going to have a lot more evidence of these things. So we have a better picture of life during the Phanerozoic than we do of that soft-bodied life in the Proterozoic. So the Paleozoic, the first part of the Phanerozoic, we start seeing a massive fossil record. So we go from the soft-bodied from the Proterozoic into animals that are starting to build mineral skeletons. Most of these animals live in marine environments. So we see a lot of marine life. And then we're going to see life start to evolve. The Cambrian period, we saw an explosion of new species. The number of species just greatly increased, and so we call it the Cambrian explosion. This is also when we're going to have some of our vertebrates arriving. So vertebrates refers to animals that have a spine, vertebrae. So this is when we're starting to get even more complex life coming about. So the first parts of the Paleozoic are the Cambrian and the Ordovician. Here we're having a lot of marine life. We're also seeing the first vertebrates. These are fish. They are jawless fish, but they're fish. We're also seeing things like algae. We are seeing some very primitive land plants. So we're seeing some things move up onto the continents. The end of this time, the end of the Ordovician, we saw a mass extinction. So there had been very diverse life in the sea, but at the end of the Ordovician, a lot of that life goes away. And during this entire time, we didn't really see anything on the land surfaces. We saw mostly marine life. So these are things that look like they belong in water. So there are a lot of corals. We're seeing starfish, brachiopods, things that are related to mollusks. So it's a very marine heavy fossil record because that's where the life was. So this is Ordovician life. We are starting to see some plants making up onto land about 470 million years ago. So the first 3.5 billion years, all life on the planet was marine. These land plants are very simple land plants. They're non-vascular. They're actually related to mosses. So things start simple and they get more complex. That's what evolution is. During this time period, we start seeing insects will follow the plants onto land. So most of the insects are going to evolve from crustaceans. So we will have life get more complex as it goes. And then we have a mass extinction. So we've started getting things up on the land. At the end of the Ordovician, which is here, we start to see we see a drop. So the blue is showing us the percentage of marine animal genera. At the end of the Ordovician, we have a little bit over 30. Over the Silurian, it drops drastically to below less than 10. So that's a mass extinction. So 50% of the marine genera and 85% of marine species. So genera is a bigger, like family. Species is the individual. Die off over this period. This is likely due to glaciation. And the glaciation would have caused sea levels to fall. So that would have reduced the amount of marine area available for these marine species to live. So we leave the Ordovician, move into Silurian, which is very short, and then into the Devonian. During the Devonian, during the Silurian and the Devonian, our fish are starting to diversify. Remember, marine life is the most common. They actually are going to start following the plants and the insects onto the land. So we have fish that start walking. They start adapting their fins to be able to move on land. So about 375 million years ago is when this is happening. This is an example of a fish that had lungs and wrist bones. So it's getting more complex. During the Devonian, we start having more complex plants as well. So this is where we start getting spore plants. So these are ferns that are happening in the humid environments. Seeds are starting to appear. We have conifers, which are the needle trees, are moving into the drier habitats. So our plant life is diversifying as well. During this time period, Laurentia, which is a big chunk of Canada and North America. Canada's in North America. A big chunk of North America is going to collide with several of the other proto-continents. So it's going to collide with Baltica and Avalonia and South America eventually. And this is happening as we have subduction occurring in this region. So we're starting to form a supercontinent. So we basically at this point have almost 2 supercontinents. We have one in each hemisphere. And when this happens, it's important because as we're having these collisions, we're forming what are known as orogenies. This is mountain building events. So this is the birth of the Appalachians, for example. So we have what's known as the Acadian orogeny. And so this is going to contribute to the Appalachian Mountains. So we can see that here. And this is what's going to start building the foundations of North America. So during the late Paleozoic, we have a very different looking world from what we had, at the beginning of the Paleozoic, even and definitely a different world from what we saw in the Proterozoic, and just very much changed from the early Earth. We're seeing lots of plants, different types of plants. We're seeing different types of animal life on the continents, and various types still in the sea. So we're having new, abundant plant life. And we know this because when those plants died, they were preserved as coal. So we're seeing massive amounts of coal that were formed during these time periods. This is also when we're going to start seeing Pangea. And the late Paleozoic is the worst mass extinction in geologic history. It's going to be the end of the Paleozoic. So this is worse than the well-known KT or KPG. It's not the worst. I would like to point out also, if you ever see on any of these, talking about the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian, those are only used in the US. Everywhere else, they just combine it into the Carboniferous. Carboniferous being for life. This is where we're seeing this coal deposits. So we see lots of life, which is then going to go into organic matter that then eventually will become coal. So Carboniferous, lots of carbon. So the trees and the ferns took over the continents. These became swamps in the Carboniferous, which then got preserved as coal beds. We also had some massive life forms. So this is a museum replica diorama showing a Carboniferous coal swamp with a giant dragonfly and a human for scale. Personally, I would not want to run into this thing. It had a wingspan of about 1 meter, so about 3 feet. That's not something I want to run into. So during this time at the end of the Paleozoic, almost all of our land had combined into Pangea. So this is one of the well-known supercontinents. So we're seeing that all of the land masses are together. This is where the ideas of continental drift came from, because these continents did used to be together. So we're having other mountain building episodes during this, you can imagine, because we are colliding these smaller land masses together to create one massive land mass. When you have 2 land masses coming together, you're going to have uplift. So this is where we're having what's known as the Allegheny orogeny, and then several other orogenies. These are also where we're going to start having the ancestral Rocky Mountains being formed. At the end of the Permian, we had a mass extinction. So here we are seeing in orange or yellow is new genera, and then in purple is extinct genera. There's a small ice age during the late Carboniferous. So at the end of the Permian, we see that the new species is fairly level. There was a drop during that ice age, but it's remained fairly level. Whereas the extinction of species, which had again been fairly even throughout prior to this, suddenly becomes significant. So we have the 70% change. We're having 70% of our mass extinction. So this is called the Great Dying. So this was the first mass extinction to affect vertebrates on land, and it nearly wiped out all the marine taxa. So almost all the marine life was gone. So between 80 and 85% of all species was gone at the end of the Paleozoic, or from the end of the Paleozoic were wiped out by this. So 95% in the oceans, 70% on land. So this is significant. Ultimately, the reason that we thought, or that we think that this happened, was because of a massive volcanic eruption in the Siberian Traps about 251 million years ago. This would have been one of those large igneous provenances, LIPs, blood basalts. Again, this is 95% of the ocean life and 70% of the continental life is gone at the end of the Permian. Obviously, that was a good place to put a end marker for a time period. So I'm going to give you a little preview of the next one, Mesozoic. So we're moving out of Paleozoic into middle life. Mesozoic is one that people love because this is when dinosaurs come about. So Pangea has fully assembled. It is also broken up. We're seeing dinosaurs appearing in the late Triassic, and then we're seeing them get more and more diverse throughout the rest of this period. We do have mammals, but mammals are very small, and there are not nearly as many of them, which probably ends up being a good thing for mammals. We're having flying reptiles, and eventually we have birds. And I think I do have time to do this. So I'm going to end with this fun little video.
Oh my God. Ellie!
They're magnificent.
My dear Dr. Grant, welcome to Devonian Park.
What are they doing?
Feeding them.
These sea stars are ruthless, all right? They can strip the plankton off that cow in as little as 7, even 6 days.
Oh, no.
What is that? Early single-cellular protista! Run! They may also possibly be early jellyfish! Scientists are undecided!
Go!
Whoa! The gastropod mollusk is on our tail! Bloody hell!
This is what happens when you play God, John. These creatures don't belong in our time. Well, actually, turtles are evolutionarily very old. They belong in both our times. It's still a dangerous predator. Oh, it's on its back.
Nice trilobite! Good trilobite!
Oh no! Raptors!
Wait a minute, this is Jurassic Park. Velociraptors are from the late Cretaceous period, and they should be half the size, and covered in feathers. The only historically accurate dinosaur in this whole damn park is the T-Rex. And you're supposed to be a scavenger, not a predator.
Hi, I'm Zach from College Humor.
All right, I just personally think that that's entertaining. So I'm going to end there, and we will pick up with Mesozoic life next Tuesday. So Have a good weekend.